Today the Lord will appear to you. We hear that 3 times, that the Lord's presence is going to be with his people in this passage. And it's scary in a way that I think we don't fully appreciate. And I hope we'll see it today as we go through this passage. One of the cool things that we get to do this year is go through the entire Bible. And so we're preaching from texts that kind of fall on the day that we're preaching. And it means that there will be some texts and passages that we preach from that we wouldn't normally pick on a normal day because they just don't kind of seem as exciting as other texts that maybe would get picked. But also, for me personally, I get to preach from texts that I've never preached from before. And that's going to happen a lot this year. I've never preached from Leviticus, ever, that I can remember. I may have, maybe 10 years ago, maybe I did, but as far as I can remember, I've never preached from Leviticus. I haven't found any sermons from where I preached from Leviticus. But one of the challenges is we're jumping from books. We spent a couple weeks in Genesis, a couple weeks in Exodus. We'll be 2 weeks in Leviticus, then 2 weeks in Number. And so it's just like 2 weeks and 2 weeks and 2. So you're just kind of skipping along the surface. But there's really deep places where we land each week. In Exodus, God delivered his people from captivity in Egypt, sent them out in the wilderness, gave them a way as a nation to live. And in Leviticus, that's kind of being fleshed out at the foot of the mountain. God is giving a way for his people to worship him and come into his presence and to live. And we saw kind of some of the prescriptions last week. We're seeing that kind of played out for the first time this morning in our passage today. So let's pray, and then we will jump right into the text. Lord, we pray that you would open our hearts and our minds to this text. We thank you for your word that guides us, that gives us direction in life. We pray that you would sink this word deep. Open our hearts and our minds to what you want to tell us. Lord, I just pray that you would guide us as we look at these things today and this word of yours. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So this passage is not for the squeamish. There's blood, there's gore, there's slaughter, and it can make us feel some kind of way. On top of that, it's pretty complicated, as Brian was sharing. There's a lot going on here that we can get really twisted and turned about. Okay, what offering is this? What does this offering do? How does this offering work? And it's a lot to take in. And we can get kind of lost in the repetition of blood and slaughter and sacrifice. Have you ever heard the phrase, can't see the forest through the trees? We're not going to get into the trees. We're going to try to see the forest today. It's a saying that means that someone's become so caught up in the details that they can't see the situation as it is and the whole situation. And that's kind of what can happen to us here if we're not careful. It can happen a lot of places in the Old Testament if we're not careful. And so we're going to try to look at the details or try to see the big picture and not so much focus on the details. On top of that, we're dealing with concepts such as God's holiness, as the sinfulness of man, and it can be hard to wrap our minds around those concepts too. So we're going to try to slow things down, pan out our camera to get an idea of what is happening and why it's important for us today. So I'm going to start off just by giving you a summary of the 24 verses that we just read. And that summary is going to serve kind of as our outline today as we go. Are you ready? Okay, here it is. Sin is a thing, and it has to be dealt with so that people can have communion and fellowship with God. And it's dealt with by a mediator for the people. So if you take notes, those 3 things can be your headings. 1, sin is a thing, a real thing that has to be dealt with. 2, because it separates us from God, a holy God. And 3, it's dealt with by a mediator for the people. So the first thing, sin is a real thing in the world, a thing that has to be dealt with. In 2008, researchers from Notre Dame engaged in a study on the state of teenagers' moral lives. And the results found that there wasn't really a shared idea among younger people of what constituted right or wrong. David Brooks in 2011 wrote an article kind of looking and examining this study. And this is what he wrote. Not many of them have previously given much or any thought to many of the kinds of questions about morality that we asked. When asked about wrong or evil, they could generally agree that rape and murder are wrong. But aside from these extreme cases, moral thinking didn't enter the picture. Even when considering things like drunken driving, cheating in school, or cheating on a partner. I don't really deal with right and wrong that often, is how one interviewee put it. The default position, which most of them came back to again and again, is that moral choices are just a matter of individual taste. It's personal, the respondents typically said. It's up to the individual. Who am I to say? I would do what I thought made me happy or how I felt in any given moral situation. I have no other way of knowing what to do but how I internally feel. Many were quick to talk about their moral feelings, but hesitant to link these feelings to any broader thinking about a shared moral framework or obligation. As one put it, I guess what makes something right is how I feel about it. But different people feel different ways, so I couldn't speak on behalf of anyone else as to what's right and wrong. The moral framework to judge between right and wrong for these study respondents was how an individual felt personally about a certain or specific thing. And if we aren't careful, then that becomes the definition of sin for anyone. It's not necessarily how this shared understanding of sin, but it's how we each feel individually about a thing, a situation. But that's not the definition of sin that we're working with today. The problem with that kind of definition of sin is manifold, and we won't get into it today. But I want to give a framework for the sin that we're operating under today. Because sin, as we should understand it, as the Bible shows it, is something different. The Christian faith teaches that there are things that are wrong because they stand in opposition to what God has commanded we should or should not do. For example, if you lie, then you're standing against the command that God gave for us not to lie. If you steal, if you're jealous, if you are prideful or lustful, all things that God has told us not to do. These are all sins. And really every religion has sins. But Christianity is the only religion that teaches that it isn't just the sins that we commit that have to be dealt with, but the fact of sin. That there is an element of our being, of who we are, that kicks against any influence that God might have over us. Oswald Chambers says this about sin. He says, sin is a fundamental relationship. It is not wrongdoing, it is wrong being. Deliberate and emphatic independence of God. The Christian religion bases everything on the positive, radical nature of sin. Other religions deal with sins. The Bible alone deals with sin. Cornelius Plantinga, in his book, Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, says this about sin. At its core, human sin is a violation of our human end, which is to build shalom and thus to glorify and enjoy God forever. We have a purpose, every single one of us. We all have a purpose, and that is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, to hold God up as the utmost good, as the right and the greatest, and to be in a relationship with Him forever. But sin convinces us that we will find happiness and peace and fulfillment in a ton of different things other than God. Sin convinces us that the thing we long for isn't God, but a million other different things. And that all of those things are independent of who God is and what God can give us. Let me give you a silly example. When a kid is in a store, in a candy store, they become convinced that this little piece of candy will complete them. And if you've ever been in a store with a little kid and they've got in their mind that they want that piece of candy, you'll understand what I'm talking about, because they are focused on that to the extent of leaving everything else in the world out. They have decided that thing, that little piece of sugar, will complete them and make their life perfect. And they can't hold any other idea in their mind. And if they can just have that candy, all will be right in the world. When their parents say no, they now have a choice. Be obedient and leave their desire behind, trusting that their parents know the best for them, which might happen in a fictional world somewhere. Or be not obedient and either steal the candy or whine and cry trying to convince their parents to get it for them, or some other variation of that way. In a way, our lives are this. There are so many things that we want, that we are so sure will give us happiness and the answer, and that it will complete us. And if we can just get that thing, if we can just pursue that thing enough. And God tells us, I know what is best for you. It's not that thing. Trust me. Live in reference to me, according to what I say. And, of course, we're obedient and we go along with Him. No, we don't. We say, no, I think I know the best way. And God, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to put you on the back burner and I'm going to pursue this thing my own way. Because deep down we don't want to live in reference to God. And it breaks the fabric of shalom that He has made. And it begins to tear things up internally. And it begins to affect the things around us, even if we do something that we don't think harms anyone. That's why Jesus can make such hard demands in the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes a lot of hard demands. For example, in Matthew 5, Jesus says, "You've heard it said, do not murder. But I say that do not harbor in your heart anger for your brother. Don't call him an idiot." Because Jesus is saying the way we feel, nobody would argue that anger is the same as murder, right? We know the difference. Anger and murder are two different things. If you murder somebody, you're going to get a lot more trouble than if you're just angry for them. But Jesus is saying what's happening in his heart is as important as what's happening as it's played out. That sin roots in your heart and it begins to make you think about people a specific way and feel about people a specific way. And it begins to tear apart the shalom of your life. Because you're finding comfort in that anger and hatred and the way you feel about that other person. And it goes on and on. It destroys the way we were meant to live our lives. And it happens first in our hearts. Sin is conceived in the heart. Gives birth to death, as we're told by James. Because we always want the things we want. We pursue the desires that we have to disconnect from God and to live without respect to God. And at the same time, though, we have this desire for something that we can only get with a relationship with God. It's really crazy if you think about it. We want these things we think will work, will fill us, and the only thing that will is the relationship with God, and yet we resist that. And God knows us. He knows his people, and he gives them what they need in the desert at the base of this mountain. God gives them a way to have what they need. He provides them a way to deal with sin, because without that, they cannot hope to even stand close to God's presence, much less have fellowship. When I was a little kid, probably first or second grade, this was, I think, the very first fight I ever got into. But I remember this guy, he was a lot bigger than me, and during recess and on the playground, after school when we were waiting on our school buses to show up, this guy would just go around and pick on people. I don't even think I knew the word bully, but I think that's what he was. He would just go around and pick on people. He was so much bigger than everybody else. And one day, I was the person that was the target of him picking. And I just remember trying to stay away from him. And I remember running from him on that day. And for whatever reason, in his mind, I was like the target. And I remember at some point, I was just thinking this is not fair. And it made me so angry. And I lost my temper and I punched him right in the face. And if you've ever seen in a nature documentary, the little birds that sit on the rhinoceros's back, and the rhinoceros doesn't even know that the bird's there. That was kind of me. I was the bird. He was the rhinoceros. The punch, he beat me pretty bad. But I got one in, you're right. But he beat me pretty bad. And I went home that night, and I was I dwelt on that. First and second grade, I'm this little kid. I'm dwelling on that, and I'm worried. I'm stressed because I don't know what's going to happen the next day. Is it just going to be a and who knows where the teachers were during all this, because they never interceded. But what's going to happen when I go back the next day? Is he going to beat me some more? Am I going to have to try to hide the whole time during recess? And the more I thought about that, the madder I got, and the more furious. And I'm how dare this person try to dictate how I'm going to spend my recess? And so I went into school the next day, and I'm I don't care. I'm going to punch him again for the first. I'm going to just get the first lick in again today. And at recess, I went and found him because I didn't want to address. And when I got up to him, he looked at me what are you doing here? And then the craziest thing, he made we were good. And he wanted to be my friend. And I said, no, we have this thing in between us that we got to deal with, or we will never be friends. Now, I wasn't that well spoken, so I didn't process all that at that point. But I walked away confused. And we did not become friends because there was this thing in between us that kept us from becoming friends. There's this thing between us and God. But this thing is more than a barrier to friendship, like a fight or something like that. It's something that is dangerous and puts us in harm's way. In Exodus 19, when God tells the people not even to approach the mountain on which his presence rests, he is sharing a fundamental truth of reality of the cosmos. There's this thing between them and him. And to pretend that it isn't won't work. And if they try to come near him, they will die. They will perish. I encourage you to read Exodus 19 again just to see how many times he says that to them. And that's really hard for us to get our minds around because we don't have a reference to think through that kind of thing. There aren't parallels. It's really hard to come up with a metaphor that really carries the power of that or the weight of that. The fact that God is holy and we are not, and what that does to our relationship, it's really hard to fathom. We get pictures of it. I've shared this before in Isaiah 6. I think it's one of the best pictures is Isaiah in this heavenly throne room, and the seraphim are all around, and they cry out, "Holy, holy, holy." And it almost undoes Isaiah, which he's just seen this through a vision. But this threefold cry is meant to emphasize God's holiness, what that means. One commentator says this. He says, God's holiness is not an aspect of who he is or what he does. No, God's holiness is the essence of who he is. If you were to ask, how is the holiness of God revealed? The only right answer would be in everything he does. Everything God thinks, desires, speaks, and does is utterly holy in every way. The best way I have to think about it is like this. Let's imagine if you wanted to take a walk on the sun. The sun is hot. If the seraphim were explaining to us how hot the sun is, they would say, hot, hot, hot. The sun is hot. In fact, some would say that our understanding of the word hot comes from sun, that without it we don't even understand it, that hotness is an essence of the sun. And if you wanted to walk on the sun, the level of preparation to be able to do this is massive. It's not possible. We don't even have the materials that would make that possible. I checked. I did a big Google search just to figure it out, if it was even possible. The last time I checked, it hadn't been. It's still not possible. You can't do enough to prepare yourself because our skin and the makeup of our bodies, it's not made to interact with the surface of the sun. You couldn't even get close to the sun before you just vaporized. It's impossible. But let's just say, for the sake of our illustration, in order to get there, you would need some kind of shield that would protect you from the sun. Without it, you'd be burnt. Without it, you would die. It would consume you. And you would need protection and preparation and so many things to keep you from being burned up. God is holy. He is so holy that you cannot hope to even be in His presence and survive. That's why when God appears, His presence, it's always shielded. He's always shielded by, it's either a vision, or He appears as a pot or a bush, or a pillar of a cloud or of fire, or in the form of a man or an angel, or however God always has some kind of shield around Him to keep the full weight of His presence from just obliterating whoever He's interacting with. Something has to be done to shield God from the people. God is holy, He's perfect, He's righteous in every way, and we are not. And we have to be protected from His all-consuming presence. All the sacrifices serve in that way. If you notice, as you look at these sacrifices in this passage, that there's an order to them. First, the priest must sacrifice for their own sins, and then for the sins of the people. And then after that, they can offer the other forms of sacrifice, fellowship, and worship. Because sin has to be dealt with before anything else. And without that, boom. I mean, we see that in the very next chapter. You'll read it tomorrow if you're following the reading plan. In the very next chapter, chapter 10, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, they take censers, these little things that carry fire in them, and they put incense in them, and they offer it to the Lord, which is against the instructions that He gave. Contrary to God's command is what we're told in Leviticus. So they sin. And this is a little sin. It's not even a big deal if you look at all the sins in the Bible. It doesn't even seem like it should be a big deal. But immediately fire comes out from the presence of the Lord, and it consumes them. And then we see this in chapter 10, verse 3. We're told this. Moses then said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord spoke of when He said, 'Among those who approach me, I will be proved holy. In the sight of all the people, I will be honored.' Aaron remained silent." Which, just those three words, Aaron remained silent, that's a whole sermon, I think, that we could go on. But the point is that God is holy, and the thing that would protect them from the holiness is obedience to His word in the application of sacrificial commands. And they thought that they could do it better, and they learned otherwise. So here's the recap up to this point. Sin is real. We all sin. We all have sin in our lives. We all have this inclination of rebellion in our hearts that puts us in a place that we're marked by sin. God is holy. Some kind of preparation has to take place to keep us from being consumed by God's holiness. Holiness and sin cannot be together. God has given his people, sinful, imperfect people, a way to be able to have that relationship and be in the presence of God in their midst through the sacrificial system. That's what we see here in our text today. Once again, notice the order. For the priests and for the people, sacrifice offerings to deal with sin, verses 8 through 11 for the priests, and then verses 15 and 16 for the people. And then the fellowship offerings and the thanks offerings. Sin has to be dealt with before worship and fellowship, always, always. And then there's someone there who handles this, who is a mediator to handle this. In our text, it's the priests. They offer sacrifice for their own sins and then for the people. They appear before God on behalf of the people. They've done the work to figure out the complications, to figure out exactly what needs to be done, in what order, and so that the people aren't killed. It's a pretty important job. There has to be someone who represents the people before God, who approaches God and risks all that the people deserve in order to stand up for the people. And that's something we see throughout, way back in Genesis 18, when Abraham learns of God's plans to destroy Sodom. Abraham pleads with God in a very delicate and deferential manner because he risks the wrath of God. And we see it kind of as a comic back and forth, but it's a real fear there. If he gets this wrong, he risks his life. It's a heavy and a big thing, not a small thing. And the priests were those people. The Levites were chosen to be those people, the people who would carry the weight of the people's sin before God and do what needed to be done to take care of the problem. They've been chosen by God for this duty, and that choosing placed upon them the burden and responsibility to take the things of God seriously. And as we see in verse 24, their faithfulness provides a way for the people to be in the presence of God in joy and worship. This appearance of joy is the first appearance of the word joy, that Hebrew word joy in all the Old Testament. That the people find what they need through the ministrations of the priests, and they're joyful and they worship, and they're maybe for the first time and maybe the last time, like fully in great worship with God. Everything seems to be going great. But we know that it doesn't stay that way because the sacrifices have to continue and keep going on and on. I closed my sermon last week by pointing out that the writer of Hebrews in the New Testament says that all this is a shadow of heavenly things, that it points to something real, and that reality is Jesus. The writer of Hebrews also says that Jesus is our true high priest, that he appears before God as the mediator between us and God, and he deals with our sin, not with the blood and sacrifice of animals, not with the blood and sacrifice of perfect, unblemished animals, but with his own self. Perfect in every respect, obedient in every respect, the one who lived perfectly in reference to God. And he makes a way for us to have that same relationship as the Father is with the Son. And yet this sacrifice is good forever. When Jesus gathered with his disciples on the night of his betrayal and arrest, he told them this very thing, that in obedience he was walking toward his death and that his sacrifice would be life for so many people. Hebrews 7:22 through 28 says this. Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. Now there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in an office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Such a high priest meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests men who are weak, but the oath, which came after the law, appointed the Son, Jesus Christ, who has been made perfect forever. That's why we don't do this anymore. That's why we don't carry animals into the church and slaughter, and we don't have to deal with the blood. That's why we don't do that, because it was dealt with once and for all by Jesus. And I know it's complicated to read through. It's really neat. If you really want to know more about all the sacrifices, you should sit in the Sunday school class, because Bob's going to be talking about those over the next 3 weeks. And it's fascinating. It's important for us to know. But don't lose the forest for the trees. Don't lose what Jesus has done for us when we come to him. Don't lose what we're getting ready to celebrate right now. If you're serving communion, if you want to go ahead and come forward. When we gather to take communion, we remember this truth. That it's through Jesus' sacrifice that we can find life, true life, the life that we were meant to live. Not some piece of candy that we thought we so desperately needed, but a feast beyond all imagination at the table of the King, who we can enjoy for all time. That's what Jesus does. And that's what we celebrate when we come to this table.